In Chapter 11, we'll be discussing managing organizational change and the resistance and conflict that come with organizational change. We need to differentiate between organizational change and project change. If you recall, we talked about project change management, and that is when we have a change, for example, in our scope. We need to go through the change management process to get the approval for that change and adjust our schedule and our budget to reflect that change. So that we have discussed before, and that is referred to as project change management. The concept and tools that we are going to be discussing in this chapter, however, they deal with organizational change. These are the changes that come about or introduced in the organization because of the project that we are implementing. Our learning objectives for this chapter are first, of course, to understand organizational change management, and then learn techniques and approaches that we can use to deal with the conflict and the resistance that comes when organizational changes are introduced. And then we pull all those understandings and knowledge to develop a change management plan for your project. Let's start by recognizing that many projects are in fact planned organizational changes. When you introduce an EHR system into a clinic where they had all manual processes, this project will introduce a significant organizational change in terms of the way people in that clinic are carrying out their work. So, and in many cases, we as project managers focus very much on the deliverables of the project and making sure that the system is working and offering the features that the stakeholders wanted. And sometimes we underestimate the changes that are required in the organizational processes and in the way people work to really fully take advantage of the system that we are implementing. So the techniques that we are going to learn as part of the organizational change management will help us and will help the organization to go through that change much more smoothly and be able to successfully take advantage of the system that we have implemented. There is a limit of how many changes at the same time we can tolerate and assimilate with. And when a number of changes occur concurrently or one after the other, they may exceed the change threshold that each of us have. And of course, that threshold varies with different people. Recognizing that people have a threshold for the level of change that they can deal with, we have to be cognizant as project managers that when we are introducing more changes in the organization because of the systems that we are implementing, we have to recognize that the individuals who are going through the changes may be facing other changes in their own personal life or maybe in the same organization they are implementing other changes. So we have to be cognizant not to overwhelm people with a number of changes, and when there are situations like that, try to be particularly supportive and helpful to those individuals who have become overwhelmed with the change. And of course, we are living at a time that we are all experiencing significant change in our personal life, professional life, and frankly, every aspect of our life through the pandemic that we are dealing with. So this is the type of skill set that a project manager needs to have to manage that change and help the organization and individuals to adopt the change. Many project managers, particularly those with technical background, don't typically get training on these soft skills of managing organizational change, and they're under wrong assumptions or false beliefs that, for example, people want this change, this system that we are rolling out, not recognizing that they may have been very comfortable with what they had before, or Monday morning they'll turn on the system and use it, neglecting the fact that in many cases starting using a new system is troublesome for many organizations, and it may require a lot of hand holding those first few days or weeks. And the other assumption that people in this organization have dealt with a lot of change, so what's one more change? That it can't be that bad. Not recognizing the concept that we just reviewed, which is the change threshold or the tolerance that people have for change. So, or they may perceive that, well, we are going to make it clear that people either have to use it or leave the organization. And again, those type of approaches may not be the most productive way to help people to go through the change and use the system that we're implementing effectively. In cases where the organization takes the approach of either use the system or leave the organization, some people may feel that, well, that may bring compliance because people are going to be afraid to lose their job, so they are going to start using it. Unfortunately, it is proven that when you force people to accept change, usually the compliance with that change is not going to be long lasting. People will find ways to get out of it or not to use it, or worse yet, they may try to sabotage the project, the effort, so that they don't end up complying with the order, if you will. And when, of course, that happens, the full benefits of that system will never be realized. This is a nice chart in terms of looking at different types of change and their impact. Starting with the one at the lower left, workflow improvement. That's when you're fine-tuning a workflow process in the organization. Let's say you're changing a few steps in patient checking process. Usually these have some limited benefits, and also the impact on the organization is minimal. Versus a process redesign. Let's say, for example, you're redesigning the process through which patients provide feedback to the organization. That has potentially more benefit, and similarly, it will most likely have more changes brought to the organization. In that example, some changes for the patient, some changes within the organization in terms of receiving and acting on the feedback from patients. On the most significant change is the business transformation, when you are actually transforming a business or part of the business. Let's say that a clinic is implementing telemedicine. That has potentially a great impact on the organization, especially in a situation where face-to-face visits are restricted. And at the same time, that telemedicine is a huge impact in terms of the changes that it brings to the organization at all levels. Regardless of if you're dealing with a negative change, maybe the change is introduced in your work environment and it has potential to reduce your responsibility or maybe even cause you to lose your job. That's obviously a negative change. On the other hand, if you view a change that is positive, that you see an implementation of a change to make your job a lot easier, you would view that as a positive change. Regardless of positive or negative nature of the change, they both have an impact. For us to deal with change, we go through some steps, and it's a process. Of course, when we perceive something to be positive, our acceptance is much faster. But nonetheless, in either case, we go through a process, and it is an emotional travel. It's an emotional journey to adapt a change. For understanding the impact of change on people, Professor Levitt has developed a conceptual model that has 4 components: people, tasks, structure, technology. Basically, he's saying that to understand the total impact on people, you have to look at how change impacts people individually. Let's say promotion or increased responsibility, or in the form of the tasks that are assigned to them, or how people get impacted by the structure of the organization in terms of the reporting relationship, or the technology that they use to get their work done. So any of these elements also may have some impact in the other parts, but it's a good way to conceptualize the entire impact of change on people. Earlier, we said that change is a process. So what does that really mean? It means, in the context of IT projects, it means that we are going from the present state where the organization is to a future state that hopefully is a desired state. And while we are going through this transition, there are various forces in the play. And Levin came up with this rather simple tool of force field analysis to look at the driving forces. Those are the forces that are actually supportive of this change, and they would like to see this change occur in the organization, versus looking also at the resisting forces. And those are the forces that are opposing the implementation of this change. And looking at both of those and then deciding what actions to take is what Levin came up with as the force field analysis. Also, earlier we said that change and reaction to change is emotional. We start with a point of stability in our life, and when the change happens, we get shocked, and we may go through the denial that maybe this change is not happening, especially if we foresee the change as challenging for us. And then we may go through a period of anger and be mad about the fact that this change is happening, and we may even try to bargain to see if we can negotiate our way out of the change. And then ultimately we may understand that this change is going to happen. We may go through a depression, being sad or being concerned about the change that now that we know that is happening. And then we may start actually testing the waters, just going with the change and see how it all works out. And of course, if it is in fact a good experience, if, for example, the system that was rolled out works effectively and efficiently and is helping the users, well, then the users may go through the acceptances and become a big supporter of this change. So this slide summarizes what we just talked about the 5 stages of dealing with change that we go through. Now that we understand organizational change and how it impacts people in the organization, how do we minimize the negative impact and the anxiety for the people who are going to be going through the change that is introduced by our project? The way to do that is we develop a change management plan. Like most other plans that we have talked about, you first start by assessing the willingness and the readiness and the ability of the organization to deal with change. How big of a change is this? And then accordingly developed or adopt a strategy, or sometimes maybe a combination of strategies for dealing with the change. You implement the change management plan, and you keep track of the progress. Again, just many other plans that we do. We develop the plan, we implement and track it, and again, like many other plans, we finally evaluate the plan, its results, and develop lessons learned, so that in the future our change management plan could benefit from our experience. Again, like many other plans that we develop, the first thing that we need to focus on is that who are the stakeholders of the change, the organizational change, who are going to be the stakeholders. They can be our sponsors. Those are the folks who are actually initiated the change, maybe propose the project that we are working on, and they want to make sure that this change comes about effectively. Then there are change agents. These are the folks who are promoting and supporting the change, such as the project manager and the project team members. Finally, who's the target of the change? Who's going to be impacted the most by this change? And these could be the users of the system that we are rolling out, maybe the patients of the organization, or other people that interact with that organization could be the targets of this change. As the change, the organizational change is communicated to the stakeholders, we assess the willingness and readiness of the stakeholders. The communication of change needs to be very clear about the real impact of the change, the breadth of the change, and when is the change over? How would we know when the change is over? And if the change impacts individuals in the organization, maybe their job changes, they need to understand those changes and understand how would they be successful, how would they be assessed in terms of their success in the changed environment, in the new environment that they have to, let's say, work with the system that we have rolled out so that they can carry out their work. Depending on the nature of the change that we are implementing and our assessment of the resistance and the support that we have from our stakeholders, we can choose one of the 4 strategies for implementing the change. The first one is empirical rational approach. This is when we build on the fact that people are generally logical and they have self-interest. They want to know how they would benefit from something, and if our change makes their jobs easier, for example, we can provide that reasoning and incentivize their support of the change. Another approach is normative re-educative approach. This is where you're dealing with an organization that has a very strong social norm and social values in the organization, and to implement a change you have to redefine those norms and values, and then people would follow the new norms and values. Power coercive approach would be that you focus on the fact that people are compliant when they are given clear direction, and when the consequences or the sanctions, if they don't do or comply with the direction, when that's clearly laid out, people move in that direction quickly. Some people may not, and then the sanctions are applied to those who don't. This is especially effective when there is a dire situation and you need to move fast. The last strategy is environmental adaptive approach. This is when you're focusing on the adaptive nature of people, and again, when you need to move the organization quickly and change it. And so what you do, you build the new organization with the values and the focus that you're interested in, and you move the people in it. And of course, again, here you have the danger that some people may not adopt or adapt themselves into the new organization and may leave the organization. There is a nice write-up that is in the reference at the bottom of the slide. I highly encourage you to read that because it gets into each of these strategies in a lot more detail. Now let me share with you some of the examples that the situations where I had to use the different strategies to uh, go through the change. The first one related to empirical rational approach. This is where you remember that we focus on the fact that people are rational and they would like to hear how they would benefit from an effort. When I was leading the technology uh, programs for probation and pretrial services, one of our long-term goals was to make our workforce mobile so that they could carry out their duties anywhere they were. And that mobile technology, we were able to sell it and get the supporters behind it by articulating the what's in it for me. The WIIFM is what's in it for me. This is something that all of us think about as we consider various situations. At any rate, the program was very successful in that people clearly saw how being able to access their systems anywhere they were on any mobile device, how effective that was, and the program became more and more popular among the officers. The next example I have is related to the normative re-education approach. This is when you have an organization with very strong norms and values. When I was the chief technology officer in the courts, one of my objectives was to simplify our overall technology landscape by standardizing on the tools that various courts use for carrying out their mission. And we had a very independent mindset in US courts, meaning that each court is very independent in terms of their operation. As such, there were many approaches for doing similar activities in different courts. So to make that change, we had to change the values, the norms in that in those organizations. So we formed an advisory group from the executives from those courts, essentially the clerk of the court, who's the chief operating officer of the court. We formed an advisory group to look at technologies for various business activities and identify the best technology as they collectively see the merits of those. And this was very effective because the other courts, when they heard where these recommendations came from their own peers, they were much more inclined to adopt those recommendations. So we were able to bring more standardization in the technology by having that approach in place. Another example is highlighting the power coercive approach, and that was when in 2013 we had a major reduction in government budgets, and this was the period of sequestration. So so we knew that the subsequent year's budget would be significantly curtailed and all of our development activities needed to be suspended. So in that situation, we had a major project going on for the next generation of our case management systems, and we had done a lot of work in terms of defining what we wanted, but we knew that with the situation that was in front of us, we will not be able to deliver that system that would have taken several years to do. So immediately we changed the focus, and I used this approach to articulate the fact of we need to identify the minimum viable product that we can put out in that same fiscal year. And again, we were able to do that by immediately focusing and changing the focus in that direction. The last example I have for environmentally adaptive approach is when I became the Chief Technology Officer, the focus and the vision for the office was very different. So I refocused the office in the way I saw technology and its value is when it directly impacts our business activities in the courts. So we made that a very high focus of everything we did. So we didn't pursue technology because it was an interesting technology or it was the latest technology. We would only pursue technologies that had immediate business impact. So to do that change in the organization, I communicated that vision very widely in my office when I became the leader. And of course, many people welcomed that and were energized by that vision. But some of the individuals in the organization were inclined to do more of the type of thing they had done in the past, and they ended up leaving the organization. So this is an example, another example of when you have to make a quick a change of the culture. That may be the approach that you use. After we decide the strategies for implementing the change, we complete our plan and we start implementing the change. And we have to point out from the outset that communication is one of the most important parts of change management. And we also saw, of course, communication has a very key role in project management as well. In the case of change management, if you don't provide good information through the proper media to your stakeholders, there would be the gap in information will be filled by the rumor mill. There are going to be guesses and predictions, and many of them are going to be wrong. So to avoid that, make sure that you have a very clear communication. It has to be both ways, meaning that you also invite your stakeholders to provide you with the feedback as they are going through this change, so that you can adjust your strategy if needs to. Similar to many other project management knowledge areas, change management, after you implement it, you need to evaluate the results, find out what did we learn from it, what worked, what didn't work, what were some of the best practices, and making sure that those are documented and made available to others who will be leading similar changes in the organization in the future. In general, there are several practices that are identified to be pretty effective in change management. We already talked about consistent communication and involvement. And as we communicate, we have to always remember that people look at changes and they look for what's in it for me. How is it going to impact me? And if the answer is positive, then they will get behind it. And if they feel that it would impact them negatively, they would resist the change. Find out from the get-go, as people need help going through the change, where do they go to? Is it a website? Are there people that have the information? Do we keep a change site that people can get the latest latest information. And always we have to come up with a way to measure and communicate quickly our progress. This is essential for encouraging people that yes, we are making progress, especially if during the change there are areas that there are quick wins that you can make some progress, some visible progress, and communicate that. Those work really well. And really promoting a culture that change is needed. When we are doing the change, make sure that the people who are sponsoring, the executive sponsors, are visible so people see who is behind it, and most of all, make sure that you listen to the people who are resisting the change and understand what are the issues that they are facing. So listen to even opposing or resisting forces, because they may offer some paths to make the change even more successful. We should expect resistance from people who are going to be to anticipate to be impacted negatively by our project, and their resistance can be overt, very obvious, or can be covert, meaning that they try to undermine our change efforts or our project covertly by discouraging perhaps other people. And sometimes the resistance may be valid for the change. Maybe they are not getting all the features that they were promised to receive. Maybe the system is not performing as well as it was promised to perform. In all these cases, again, communication is the most important thing to make sure everybody understands why, if some features were dropped, that you will get back to them and maybe you'll add those in the future. And sometimes the resistance is due to cultural or behavior reasons. I shared with you the example with the clerks of the court and forming the advisory group to make recommendations for best practices to their peers, to the other clerks. If we had done another way, meaning forcing or dictating the best practices from the administrative office, most likely that would not have been successful. So why do people resist change? In most cases, it's when people perceive that the change is going to impact them negatively. We talked about this earlier. They may think that it's going to cause them to do more work. Maybe the change would take away some of their responsibilities. They don't welcome necessarily the work environment that they had will be disrupted by this change, and it would not be the same as the way they knew it and they were good at doing it the old way. And also they may feel that the change is imposed on them, and usually people don't like to be forced to do something, so they may have a natural resistant reaction to it. Even the way the change is announced and who was involved with making the decision on change may have impact in its success and how people perceive the change. As people resist change, it's inevitable that conflict will come about. And conflict management is the approach of how we prevent, manage, and resolve the conflicts that come about. One of the most important aspects of conflict management is to be able to address conflicts early and come up with a way to address them. We should point out that conflicts can be positive if there are some disagreements on the project and other ideas are thrown in and ultimately adopted by the team. Well, those conflicts are actually positive. They bring about better ideas, better solutions. But negative conflicts are the ones that we definitely need to focus on in terms of identifying them and resolving them as soon as possible. We cannot ignore them because they will continue to damage the relationship, the trust that exists in the organization, and essentially be the source of a lot of stress and low morale and the like. So it really is something that needs to be addressed and resolved as quickly as possible. So again, conflict has to be dealt with. It's inevitable and it has to be dealt with. Some people feel that we can avoid conflicts, but it's almost impossible in any project setting not to have conflicts. Some try to ignore conflicts and they think that by ignoring it, it would go away. But the reality is that conflicts don't go away, and as we just said in the previous slide, they actually become bigger and more harmful to the organization in terms of promoting mistrust and the like. So the best way to address conflicts is head on, just confront it directly. So there is a range of views on conflicts. The traditional, or I would call it actually legacy view, is what we talked about in a couple slides back, and that is that to avoid conflicts. And why can't we get along? Let's just ignore it and everything's going to be okay. On the other end of this spectrum is interactionist view. This is a view that conflict is actually necessary for good performance. So you make sure that there is always somebody who at least plays the role of devil's advocate. So they look at things and they come up with the devil's advocate view on that particular issue. The contemporary view is somewhere balanced in between the two, and recognizing that conflict is inevitable and there are positive and negative conflicts, and as we talked, we need to be aware of those and deal with them accordingly. When conflicts arise in projects, we have to decide how to deal with it and how to resolve it. But the way we go about doing that depends on the type of the conflict that we are facing and the importance of how important is this conflict, the time pressure that we have to resolve this. Do we have time for lengthy negotiations, or do we need to solve this quickly? Also, the position of power of the two sides of the conflict. Does one have a lot more power on the other person, or are they peers? And another important issue is that what is the emphasis or what is the intention of you when you go to resolve a conflict? Are the goals and objectives of the project, are those most important for you, or are they the relationships that you have with the other person that you have conflict with? There are a number of ways we can deal with conflict. As we mentioned, we can avoid conflict by basically ignoring it and retreat or withdraw from the situation and hoping for it to get resolved by itself. As we have talked about, that typically does not happen. Another approach is to accommodate the opposing party by trying to appease them and basically give in to their demands and give up what we are looking for. Another approach is forcing our position. This is particularly valid if we have the power structure is as such that we have authority over the other party, and we can force our view on the other side. Typically, these, if we resolve the conflict that way, it probably will not have the lasting, it will not last for a long time. Another approach is compromising, is really looking for somewhere between our views and try to bargain our positions and land in somewhere between our two positions. The last approach we can have is to actually collaborate with the other party. This is similar to compromising, but in this approach, we're actually brainstorming and looking for ideas that could satisfy both of our positions better. In a way, we are trying to increase the pie so that each of our shares are actually more than what it is currently. So with that, this concludes my lecture on chapter 11, and thank you for your attention.